Hi everyone, my name is Robert. Rock.
My name's Zoe Adams.
My name's Maddie Kemler.
We are all student leaders of the U.S. Health Justice Collaborative who have organized tonight's event, First Do No Harm, Doctors and Sex Abuse. Before anything, we'd like to thank the extensive list of co-sponsors who made this event possible. I'm just going to list off a bunch of departments. The Poynter Fellowship, the Yale School of Medicine Department of Pediatrics, the Yale School of Medicine Department of Psychiatry, the Yale School of Medicine Medical Student Council, the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School, the Yale School of Medicine Program for the Humanities in Medicine, the Yale School of Medicine Program for Biomedical Ethics, the Yale School of Medicine Office of Graduate Medical Education, the Yale School of Medicine Committee on the Status of Women in Medicine, and the Yale University Graduate and Professional Student Senate. In her essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, Audre Lorde, the renowned poet, writer, and activist, asserts rape is not aggressive sexuality, it is sexualized aggression. This statement is important because it reframes our understanding of sexual misconduct as not solely an issue of gender, but as an issue of power. Whether sex abuse on the part of priests in the Catholic Church, the mishandling of sexual assault on university campuses like this one, or within the military, there are countless prominent examples of abuses of power by trusted institutions in recent history. The recurring theme of these events is that when esteemed groups within our society are given the unique responsibility to police themselves with little to no scrutiny, we place the most vulnerable within those groups and overseen by those groups at risk.
Sexual harassment within healthcare, whether between physician and patient or physician and another provider, is only different from these other institutions in that the medical profession has never taken on sexual misconduct as a significant priority. This has been allowed to persist because this privileged profession is shrouded in secrecy and operates through a hyper-hierarchical structure that hinders individuals from speaking truth to power. After years of sacrifice and grooming, individuals within the fraternity of medicine are often made to value their allegiance to their professional society over their allegiance to society at large. In Women Redefining Difference, Audre Lorde goes on to say that as long as male domination exists, rape will exist. Only women revolting and men made conscious of their responsibility to fight sexism can collectively stop rape. Tonight, we come together from different corners of the university and different stages in our training to ask ethical questions fundamental to justice and social responsibility.
Asking such questions or speaking out against sexual assault in tight-knit, closed-off communities is hard. Whether as a victim or survivor or as a bystander, it takes a certain kind of bravery to step forward. Such bravery is exemplified by the two very special guests who will lead the discussion tonight, Maria Zito and Carrie Teegardin. Carrie Teegardin is an award-winning investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and lead writer for the Doctors and Sex Abuse investigative series, the result of national investigation into sexual misconduct by physicians involving patients that reviewed more than 100,000 medical board orders relating to disciplinary action against doctors since 1999. Maria Zito is a self-employed native of the Boogie Down Bronx. She visited Dr. Raja Jagtiani with severe neck pain, where he took her breasts from her sports bra and aggressively groped them. In October of 2018, he pleaded guilty to criminal sexual contact after Ms. Zito, 4 other patients, and 3 employees accused him of touching them improperly. Ms. Zito will first tell her story, then Ms. Teegardin will use it as a stepping-off point to discuss the scope of the issue and the current obstacles to structural reform. We will then open the floor for discussion and questions. Take it away.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So I guess I'll start with the day that I went to the doctor. I have a history with the doctor. He had been my doctor for 9 years, so I trusted him. He saw my kids grow up. It was that kind of situation. He saw me through a depression that I went through. My daughter got very ill at one point, and I needed some help getting through that, handing me tissues when I was crying. So I trusted this man. He never gave me any reason not to but, you know, not to be afraid with him in the room alone or anything of that nature. So the day before I made an appointment, because I usually go to the hospital when I have neck pain, but this was so severe. I couldn't move really. I could drive, but it was, so I just didn't want to go to the emergency room. Went to him. Now mind you, in the 9 years I've been to him, I never had any pain medication given to me ever from him, just antidepressants. So he, you know, did the examination. It was just the normal, called the prescription, you know, typed the prescription in, and he decided that he made something up and said, well, you know, let me touch your back. And before I knew it, I went kind of in my pajamas because I couldn't move that day, so I was very like sports bra, you know, shirt. And before I knew it, my shirt was over my head and my sports bra was, you know, down. And he just, his eyes just glazed over. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. He was not present. And, you know, people ask me like, well, why didn't you stop him? And it's like, it was almost like an out-of-body experience. Like, I was there, but I was over here, you know, and I couldn't. It went on for about 40 seconds, and he was hurting me. And he was hurting me. He was, to the point he was so close to me, it was like I could feel his, you know, his breath. And I snapped out of it, and I screamed, "Get off of me!" And he just backed off. You know, he was like in between my legs. That's how close he was. It was just, and I remember just, and after he was done, he said, "Oh, you know, get ready to go into the other room for your IV infusion." And I was like, and I remember opening the door, and the secretaries were like right there, and they both kind of looked at me and asked if I was okay, and I just, you know, I just ran out. And I went home and I cried. I sat on my couch and cried. And then I started thinking, well, is it something I did? Did I, you know, was it me? Is it my fault? Am I imagining things? And I had black and blues and I had cuts and, you know, it's hard to like process when it happens because you still can't believe it happened. And a friend of mine who works down at the police station said, you know, you have to report this, or you have to come down and do something about it. And I said, okay, I will. And the funny part about it is that the police department treated me as if I did something wrong. They didn't believe me. They accused me of being, was I getting pills from him? Was I a pill popper? And I said, well, you can get my medical records. There's no record of me ever getting any type of pill like that from him, if you're going to accuse me of that. And they just didn't believe me. And I said, would you like to see the scratches and the bruises? The same day. And I watch a lot of detective DNA shows. And I said, well, you can have my sports bra. It's got his DNA on it. I went home and put it in a bag, put it in my closet. Because I said, well, if he's going to say no, his DNA is going to be on the bra. If I was there for my neck, why was his DNA all over? You know, they didn't care. They didn't care. They called me back down to the police station twice. They would put me in a room and interrogate me. And it got to the point where I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And then I got a phone call from one of the detectives, and he said, well, we called him down here, and he must be a sociopath because he didn't flinch. So, you know, we don't really know what to tell you. I said, okay. I said, I don't know what else to tell you, but, you know, I know what he did to me. I said, I've offered you guys everything I can offer. And then it just got worse because then my phone started to ring, and it was blocked numbers. It went on for about 2 or 3 weeks. And one day I decided to pick it up because I thought it was my son, and it was snowing. And it was his secretary, Maria. And she said to me, oh, hi, Maria, this is Maria. She said, I'm calling you from my cell phone. I said, okay, well, why are you calling me? She said, well, you know, the police were here and they talked to the doctor and, you know, we just want to straighten this out. You know, we know it's a misunderstanding, don't you think? And I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, a misunderstanding? I'm like, were you in the room? You weren't. And she harassed me for a good 2 to 3 days. I started getting scared. Then I started looking over my shoulder. And finally, one of the detectives did go down to the doctor's office and say, hey, if you don't leave Mosito alone, you're gonna get arrested. And it stopped from there. But it was still like they just didn't believe me until he bit one of his workers. And that's when it became very like public, and all of a sudden they believed me. But that whole time I was suffering. I was, I went through withdrawals. I couldn't focus. I was like screaming at night in my sleep. His face would come to me, and it was just, I want to say it's the worst thing I ever went through, because I've been through a lot. But for some reason, and I feel like he chose me because he knew my history. He knew I had depression. I was fighting it. He knew I had weak moments where I am a domestic abuse survivor, and some of the things that I suffer from past ailments, he's had to care for them. So he knew that I had already been in weak positions, and maybe he assumed I wasn't going to say anything. But my thought process was, there's no way I saw teenage girls going into his office. I started doing my research, and I found a woman online it was from 2009, and he had done it to her. So I got her name, found out who she was, because I was on a mission at that point, because I would drive past the doctor's office and I'd see patients, and it would eat me alive, and I'd say, I can't, as a human being, I can't let this keep going on. And I said to myself, I'm going to get him shut down no matter what I have to do. And I tracked this lady down and went to her door, and she wanted no part of me. So there I stood alone again. And so I stood alone for a long time. Even after other people came behind me, nobody showed up in court. I was the only one. So from day one, I was scared. I was scared of him. I was scared of what he might do to me. But there was no way I wasn't going to not take him down for what he did. Because I knew it wasn't going to change if he kept his license. I knew it wasn't going to change, and that's what he was fighting for. He went once for therapy, and he thought he was going to get his license back. And that wasn't, considering the damage he did to me, you get so far in life, you get past one thing, and you build yourself up again, and he just knocked me back down again. And for somebody to do that, once I get back up, I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you. So that was. I think the worst part for me was the police. You go and I have many police friends. I'm not saying anything. The detectives. Our voice needs to be heard, because if you're saying somebody did something to you, and they're saying no. My medical records went missing. I had to deal with a lot when I said, I didn't get any pills. All of a sudden, my medical records went missing. It took me a lot to get them. And then I didn't go to the doctor for 2 years, and I was not feeling well, and I was, sick, but I was too traumatized to let anybody touch me. Even my daughter, I didn't want anybody near her. I didn't want any doctor. So, it's caused a lot of trauma, but at the same time, in the end, I had to make sure, and I fought for what I thought was right, and that was for him not to have his license anymore. And that's what I got in the end. And that was the most important thing. I'm gonna fight every time he goes to court and tries to get it back. I'm gonna be there saying, no, you traumatized me. Somebody's life doesn't make it any better that everybody knows he did it. Doesn't make it any better that he's not gonna practice for 10 years. Because in 5 years, he could probably get it back. And he's gonna do it again. There's no way somebody like him is not gonna do it again. And I felt like he was put in my path for a reason, so I could stop him. The funny thing is that people were well aware of what he was doing for many years, and nobody said anything. And the secretary was well aware, people in an office upstairs were well aware. So my anger is directed toward several different areas of just somebody could have stopped him, and it could have been prevented. Like you could have. So when it came to me, I said, well, it's going to stop, and I made sure it stopped at me, and it did, and that was my main goal with everything. So, yeah, that's it.
Okay, I'm Carrie, and I just want to thank Robert, Zoe, and Maddie. Thank you so much for organizing this. We've been asked to speak to a lot of people, but it's usually not physicians who ask us to talk with them. And I'm really inspired by your generation of healthcare workers. I think there's going to be a lot that's going to change in the coming years. And so we really appreciate your interest in this. And I will say this is one series that I've done that has had a lot of interest from young people. I've been interviewed by high school and college journalists from around the country, and that's been really great for me. Somebody who works in newspapers, which generally appeal these days to older folks, or still the ones who are getting and going on their front porch in the mornings and getting a printed product. But this really drew a lot of people into investigative journalism, and so that's been a really great thing for us to see that take place. And I will say, I'm just one of a huge team of reporters at the Atlanta Journal and Constitution that worked on this series. There were lots of us, and just one. I'm just one who happens to be here, but it was a big project for us. I guess I wanted to say I'm really happy to be here at this time. You know, when we did this series, there was a lot that hadn't happened yet, right? There was the Me Too movement had not even been thought of at that point. And I do feel like the findings in our series are reverberating, and we're finding more interest in our work now, and being here is part of that. But I do feel like it's such a big issue of our time, and we're glad that we were in a position to contribute to this whole topic. How did we discover this story? People usually ask me about this, and it wasn't like we sat around the office and said, hey, why don't we check into physician sexual misconduct? Let's take a look at that. That's not what happened at all. The way we got into this is my colleague Deanie Robbins, who is a very experienced investigative reporter, was working on another story about a doctor, a prison doctor, who was working in the women's prison in Georgia, Dr. Nazir. He'd been kind of booted out of New York for some licensing issues, and he got a job working in a prison in Georgia. And so, because he had had a disciplinary history, Deanie Robbins became interested in his record. And just, you can check out the Nazir story, you might find that interesting, because there were a lot of women inmates who died because he withheld care from them. So that's a whole other topic for you guys to explore at some other time. But while Deanie was working on the Nazir story, he started looking at, just kind of looked at medical board orders, like, oh, well, what else are doctors getting in trouble for in Georgia? He was actually waiting to get some other records, so he had some time on his hands, so he just started looking on the board website. Oh, well, what's going on out there? And he kept running into these cases of physician sexual misconduct, and just reading the cases, he was pretty disturbed at some of the stuff he was reading. But what really upset him was he was seeing the doctors were being returned to practice, and he was, pretty shocked by that. And so we had a discussion at that time. I was working on another project, and so we're trying to assess, well, is this just a Georgia thing, or is this something that's happening elsewhere? And so we set out to try to figure that out, assuming that probably somebody was keeping track of this. At state medical boards, you could call them and find out, well, let us see all your cases of physician sexual misconduct. And the first thing we found out was nobody really keeps track of this. Nobody really studies it. Nobody really gathers data on it. It was very, very hard to get any kind of information. The states that we did check into in sort of the same way by looking at cases, we kind of quickly learned that, okay, it wasn't just a Georgia thing. This idea of seeing numerous cases of physician sexual misconduct and having medical boards return doctors to practice was not in any way uncommon. But then we had to figure out, okay, how do we study this, given that there really wasn't any significant research on it outside of some work that Public Citizen has done and had done a number of years ago. In order to do that, we needed to find every public disciplinary order related to sexual misconduct that had ever been made public. In order to do that, we had to get every medical board disciplinary order. In order to do that, we had to get our data journalists involved, and we had to go out and scrape every website to basically collect every board order that was on a website. And then after doing that, which was pretty laborious because each website was kind of different, then we had to kind of come up with a system for how do we find the cases, right, that we're trying to look at. To do that, we set up, sort of using machine learning, a way to scan all the documents to look for certain keywords, and that refined over time so that we had cases that we knew we wanted to read. And then, so that's kind of very briefly describing what took a long time. Then we had to read the cases. And a lot of medical board orders are, some of them are really short in the states that really don't tell you much, but in a lot of states they're, 20, 50, 100, 200 pages long. And so there was a time period when our core group of reporters did nothing all day, every day, but pour a big cup of coffee every morning and just sit there and read documents, and we had a way of keeping track of what we were finding. That was a really hard weeks and months of reporting. You saw and read these cases that were just unbelievable and hard to read. And the only way we really kind of got through that was because we knew we were finding something that really needed to be exposed and hadn't really been exposed to the extent that we were discovering it needed to be. And we also just constantly talked about it. We were in constant communication. You can't believe the case I just read. Come over and look at this case. Because it was just startling, some of the stuff that we were finding. And our words were often, I can't believe they let this guy go back into practice. This is one of the first people in the main story of the series, the first anecdote that we ended up using. After many cases, we were trying to find some more recent cases. This was probably 200 pages of everything from sexual misconduct to improper prescribing to malpractice issues. And this was just one detail out of the 200, but it was pretty compelling. And this was sort of a classic case of what the kind of thing that we saw. This wasn't even really the worst one, but a dog, she's examining the patient's abdomen, and then all of a sudden, in the midst of that, he's rubbing her genitals, placing his mouth on her genitals, and she confronted him later, and his comment was, it was so beautiful, I couldn't resist. And that's during a medical exam that happened, and that kind of thing became for us routine. The main, I guess I'll just want to share with you the key findings. Many many doctors violated patients for years before they stopped. I'll talk about them later, but there were doctors with more than 1,000 victims. How many sexual predators can accumulate that many victims, right? And the reason doctors really deserve special scrutiny is, think about the situation. You're in a small room, you don't have your clothes off, and the person is allowed to touch you. So So it's a very vulnerable situation that you're in. Excuse me. Routinely doctors are allowed to return to practice. Not unusual at all. It's just more commonplace. It's not just medical boards, okay? There are a lot of laws involved that play into this as well, and also reporting issues. You know, how do hospitals handle these things when they come up? Medical organizations, criminal justice system, how do police react when someone comes and reports, when it's a doctor involved? We found that it was generally treated as an illness, especially by medical boards when this kind of thing happens. People in the medical profession are healers. They see someone who has a problem that needs to be addressed, not as much viewing it as a crime was one of the things we found. And then there's often secrecy in this. A lot of medical boards will use private disciplinary orders, even in sexual misconduct cases. One medical board executive director said if you're trying to salvage someone, you don't want to ruin their reputation. So you need to keep this secret. Also, they knew that it was very damaging and they felt that it could ruin somebody's career if someone were publicly disciplined. One of the doctors we wrote about was, this is a case that Danny really dug into, and it was one of the first ones he read in the Georgia Medical Board website that I think first got his interest in this program. And it really points to how, as Maria shared, doctors know the vulnerabilities of the people that they're seeing and sometimes play off of that if they're wired this way. This guy, he started out with a suicidal soldier, went on to jail inmates, like you're pretty vulnerable when you're in that situation. And then later on, abused a mentally ill woman and a child of 14, both in that same clinic. Every time he was effectively given a pass, he's still licensed in Georgia. This kind of shows you how disturbing this can be. I don't know if you probably can't read this, but this gives you an idea of, we had to dig down into documents. We get medical board orders when there were cases that were criminal in nature. We could sometimes get the criminal cases, which would give you a lot more details. This was the first time that he got in trouble, and this was a psychiatric patient back when he was a military doctor. The patient is crying and very upset, asking and admitting that she was having a sexual relationship with this doctor. One day he asked me to come to his office to talk about a problem, and then he locked the door. She's crying. What do you feel right now? And the patient says, I feel like a slut. I want to die. I just want to die. And that just shows you how damaging this can be. Again, we see often, this wasn't a psychiatrist, but we often see patients, the line is crossed with psychiatrists, and it's so damaging. We've had numerous situations of suicides that would result. This is when she was in the jail, the later incident, when he was abusing people in the jail. And he placed his hands on her vagina while examining her, states that Ahmed inserted his finger into her vagina without gloves, exposed himself and ejaculated in his hand during an exam. We've seen, that's not at all unusual. We've seen that happen to patients quite a few times. He was criminally prosecuted, but he was able to plead down, and he kept his license in Georgia, even several times. This was a woman we interviewed, Patrice Gable, who was one of the victims who had a psychiatric issue that, and they ended up, when they found out about it at the hospital, offered her money to resolve it. And I understand their words were, well, wouldn't you like a new car? And so that pretty much took up the case. And she was surprised when we came to her and she assumed that he was probably locked up. This is the nurse who worked in the jail and who also spoke with us. She's in a video that we have. But when you see people from outside the profession that we interviewed, sort of their responses to this, it kind of shows how the self-policing, you know, where everyone has their way of dealing with this on medical boards. A lot of people are, when they really find out about the cases, aren't comfortable with the outcome. This was a nurse who knew exactly what happened. She was really disturbed that that happened. This was one of the law enforcement officers in the last case, and she had investigated the case and couldn't believe again that the medical board, which is majority doctors in Georgia, as it is in most states, allowed him to keep practicing. I will say that there are cases where it doesn't go this way, where the cops believe you. And we have a video about this case on our website. This is in Ohio, where a woman went to the doctor, had a problem, and like Maria, went to the police, and they actually believed her. And then when they started asking around, they found out there was another victim who, like you, had kept an article of clothing that had DNA. These guys were told they had a cop who believed and a prosecutor wanted to pursue the case. And they felt like, for once, they had evidence, right? They had an article of clothing with DNA. It was kind of like a Monica Lewinsky situation. And so they pursued the case, even though as a young prosecutor, they were told, look, you're never going to get a conviction on a doctor. And they talk about that in the video. But they pursued the case, and the guy was locked up. And Ohio has not allowed him to return to practice. I believe he was working in a car wash. We also found that, again, in this idea of not treating this as a crime, as more of an illness, that it's very common that police are not told. A medical board will handle something that it's a crime, but it's not an automatic that the cops got to be called when there are allegations of sexual misconduct that are actually potentially sexual assault. Some states do require that. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the laws. But we have a story that just sort of covered that whole issue. You may think like I'm off topic here, advertising a movie, but we did find, if any of you guys saw the movie Spotlight, that was the Boston Globe's reporting on the pre-scandal and exposing that. Coincidentally, this movie came out while we were in the midst and kind of deep in our reporting, and one of our editors one day decided, let's all go to see Spotlight together. That would be a good break for us. And so we did, and throughout the reporting, especially for me, I found a lot of parallels with the pre-scandal and these cases. And I often found it very helpful to talk with people about that when I was interviewing them, because the pre-scandal was farther along, right? We started to learn that the pre-scandal wasn't just a few guys, it was a lot. And we learned also that there was like a cover-up that wasn't right. And people knew that. They knew that kind of in their gut, And so when people were kind of, when I was running, especially on the medical board, sometimes I would stop and just say, well, was it okay? I mean, should they have returned the priest? Like, I would bring that up because I found that people were farther along in their thinking about that. But there were many similarities in terms of the intimacy of the relationship, as well as the larger institution, both sending people off for treatment and then moving them to another parish, and the way medical boards handle that. And if you ever watch the movie, it's very accurate in about its portrayal of journalists, down to our kind of pretty bad way of dressing and bad language and dysfunctional behavior sometimes. So we all love the movie because it really captured us in all of our idiosyncrasies for sure. One thing that was really eye-opening to us was that the degree that this is treated as an illness, and I don't know, are many of you familiar with the physician health programs that are in pretty much every state? Okay, physician health programs are these organizations that are available to physicians generally when they have a substance abuse issue, and in some states when they have a sex abuse issue. And it's sort of a place where you can go and get treatment, and it has generally affiliation with your state medical board. Often there's confidentiality involved because they want to encourage people to refer themselves to the PHP. And the PHP will often kind of set certain conditions that require you to do certain things for your recovery. it's sort of controversial whether or not it's appropriate to use the PHP for sexual misconduct, but they're widely used, and it's a whole industry. We're familiar with them, but there are these, you go off to different centers across the country, and your medical board in these cases will order you to go and get evaluation and treatment to help them determine whether they think you're safe for practice again. And I've talked to many doctors who've gone to these. They feel like they're very tough. There's a lot of polygraphing involved, a lot of learning empathy. They deal with a lot of people who have narcissistic personality disorder, compulsive behaviors, and they say that they can make physicians safe to return to practice, that they are very good at that. I think there's an attitude in a lot of medical boards, and Larry Dixon was not afraid to talk about this. This was the longtime director of the Alabama Medical Board who was, again, I appreciated the fact that he wasn't afraid to go on the record and explain what pretty much every medical board's thinking was. As you guys know, there's a lot that goes into making a health professional. Okay, there's a lot of money that goes into it, not just yours, but institutional money. States invest a lot in this. And so there is a strong desire to preserve the physician. Physicians are needed, as he said. You don't think there's a need for physicians, then leave Atlanta where there's a lot of doctors, go down to a little Georgia town and get sick. See how far they have to go to find a doctor. So that attitude is very much present in medical licensing boards, and it's understandable. The question is, how far do you take that, right? How far do you go in preserving someone's ability to practice given what their history is? And that's kind of what the ongoing debate is now at a lot of these boards when they take up these cases. Some people feel like, certain things you do, you just can't, you lose your license. You cross certain lines, we don't care if you can maybe be rehabilitated. You're not coming back because you just can't do that. Others feel like it's just imperative to give that opportunity. And so that's, a big issue. This is Dr. Gene Abel. He's actually a psychiatrist. He's retired now in Georgia. And he kind of created this whole industry and these treatment programs for physicians who offend. After our series, the Georgia Medical Board that had relied on him for many years invited him to come and kind of talk with them about, okay, how do these cases work? And he talked about his whole program, which again involves lots of chaperones and lots of polygraphing because, guys who've been in this program, he feels like they need to be watched very closely. And so there's a whole kind of thought process that goes around that. If somebody really needs to be watched that closely, should they be back in exam rooms? But that's a debate that can honestly be had. One point he made that stuck with me during that meeting that we hadn't really heard from anyone else before. This is a guy who spent decades in this field, said he strongly advised anyone who's a hospital executive or an administrator in a healthcare practice to take very seriously sexual harassment by a physician. He kind of described that as sort of a gateway drug to these much more serious incidents of actual sexual assault. Doctor, what he said in his experience, sees that they can get away with sexual harassment with colleagues or making inappropriate comments to patients, and whoever supervisor is doesn't take that seriously, it will escalate, or it may escalate. Often that's kind of a starting point. And I think that's something for all of us in this room to think about. What have we all seen take place that made it seem like an inappropriate remark and that was it, that was overlooked? I think anyone who's worked in academia, we've heard from medical residents, we've heard stories about what residents have been through. I think it's a big issue for anyone who's in the healthcare setting, especially now with Me Too. How do you handle that? And is your own career going to be jeopardized if you do speak up and call out a powerful man who is starting that way. But that was enlightening to hear that from Dr. Abel, who has spent more time with physicians who've assaulted patients than probably anyone else. You know, one thing that kind of bothered us, and that actually at least one state is now addressing, is that we kept seeing all these doctors going off for therapy. You know, they were going off to, especially this place called the Sante Center, where they would do art, and they would do yoga, and they would have therapy with horses, and try to kind of, you know, deal with their issues in a place that sounded, you know, like that wasn't prison. You know, it was pretty, you know, it wasn't I think it was hard for a lot of them, but you see what I'm saying. And we very rarely saw any mention of, you know, what about the victims who need therapy? Was there ever, the medical boards didn't really consider that part of what their responsibilities were, but you just don't really see much mention of that. And we know from hearing Maria and our hearing so many stories that these encounters are really damaging, and we kind of felt like that was maybe a missing piece of this whole debate. And I know of one state, actually, after our series came out, actually had a medical board member who's a judge, a retired judge, who actually said, we need to sit down and talk about this. And one thing that came out of that were more referrals for therapy for the complainants. Even if they felt they weren't able to discipline the doctor, they did understand finally that someone else in this equation needed to heal besides the doctor. And so we'd like to see maybe a little bit more of that. Confidentiality is a big piece in this. Again, the PHPs, pretty much everything that happens in there is top secret. Sometimes if somebody goes off the rails after they're under an order for the PHP, you may see later referred to in a medical board document that they've been under the PHP and they went off the rails. But normally, you don't really know what happens there. And that's, again, by design, that's all confidential. I think that's something else to be kind of considered, how much confidentiality makes sense. And one thing I should have said early on is, while we found all these cases by reading documents and doing all of our machine learning, we knew that there were many, many, many cases we never knew about. So, and we wrote about some of them that were initially treated with private disciplinary actions. Again, we found out about them because there was a public order later when he reoffended. But we also know that there were many complaints that never went anywhere. And there's no way for us to know. Complaints, pretty much every state, are secret, even by the topic. So it's very hard to gauge how many of these never even get beyond that stage. And then that doesn't even get to people who never report, because why? Who's going to believe me? I'm going up against a doctor, especially if it's somebody who's vulnerable in their experience. I think in this room, again, this question of reporting others is one of the biggest issues in this. As this Emory professor described, you're going against here the historical, traditional sensibility of doctors to protect one another, to give their peers an excessive benefit of the doubt. I don't know if that rings true to any of you, just in what you've experienced in training, but that's, I would say it's alive in a lot of medical boards themselves, because medical boards are generally mostly made up of doctors, right? So you're kind of dealing with people who are identifying with the physician, and when it's a self-policing system. And you know, I've talked to a lot of lawyers and working on this story too, and you know, what they say is, oh, we're not like that. We love to call each other out. We're less likely to cover just because of how we're wired, in terms of attorneys. But there is a tradition of this, I think, that a lot of people have spoken about, and I think it's something for medicine to confront. We found a lot of cases that would really, surprise you in who you can get your license back after prison. You can get your license back even if you're a registered sex offender. You can, this was one case that Danny really dug into. This was a guy in South Georgia where he went to prison on a drug case, but it was sex for drugs. He had pictures of all these women where he had a kind of a bedroom above the office, and he had pictures of all the women who he was doing sex for drugs with, and that became evidence in the case. He went to prison, he got out, and Georgia gave him his license back, even though part of the sentence was he had to turn in his license. But there wasn't really anything that they could make that stick. And some of the folks who worked on that case were pretty upset about that. You know, the pimp with the prescription pad is what one of the prosecutors called him. And this was a comment that the agent who investigated the case talked about. And this talks about medical boards. You know, of course, if a doctor gets his license back, of course, he's going to try to do that. It's like the priest getting another parish. Whose issue is that really to deal with? And he just sort of talked about who's letting him through, you know, and does there need to be more scrutiny of that? In Kentucky, they have some laws that actually makes it sort of hard to turn somebody down when they come back for reinstatement if they've been revoked. In most states, they don't have permanent revocation. You might be revoked, but you're often able to come back and petition for reinstatement. And sometimes because of case law, it can be hard to turn people down. And their attorney there was pretty obvious and said, look, sometimes we try to load people up with restrictions instead of taking their license because we're afraid they might come back and just get their license with no restrictions, which we feel might be more dangerous. But it shows you that medical boards themselves can be hampered in what they want to do because of the laws that they're dealing with. This was where our team, it was mostly our project editor Lois Norder and I went off kind of on a pretty nerdy venture of studying the state laws that govern medicine in every state. And that was because we felt like people needed to understand how the laws worked in this. Number one for the best laws that we rated every state and gave them a score, was Delaware. They had the best laws, and there was a reason for that. They had a doctor there, a pediatrician named Dr. Earl Bradley, who assaulted at least 1,200 children. We tell his story. He'd been reported, and a lot of them were toddlers primarily. He was reported numerous times, and it was brushed off every time. It's a pretty horrifying case, and he is in prison now. But a bunch of nurses complained about him. He would catheterize all these little girls, saying that really needed to happen, and it was like kind of a very routine thing. And the nurses who worked with him were pretty horrified. And they actually looked at it and came back and said, oh no, that's legit. And that was just one of the times when he was given a pass. If you can read the story and see that it happened numerous times. And everybody was really horrified with Dr. Bradley. It ended up being a case that Beau Biden, when he was Attorney General in Delaware, really handled and was able to pass a lot of legislation in the wake of that. The reason they caught Bradley was he videotaped the assaults. And we've also found that that's not uncommon, but the reason why they were able to make the case was that they found the videos. And there was a law school dean who was brought in to really study this, kind of how did this happen that he was able to keep practicing for so long. And she's told me, you know what, if they wouldn't have found the videos, he'd probably still be practicing today. And 1,200 kids, it was a small town, it was a huge number of that town's population that their children had been sexually assaulted. This was a cop who tried to make a case against him and was not able to make it happen. And he kind of brings up this attitude too of the way that the culture kind of protects physicians. It's very hard for people to believe that it's going to happen, and when there is evidence, again, if there's a benefit of doubt, yeah, using catheters and all those little girls, yeah, you could make an argument. You know, that's kind of how it comes down. Poor Mississippi, they always end up in these rankings, sometimes not faring well, but they ended up last in our ranking as well. In an upcoming report, we'll kind of talk about what happened in Mississippi when they brought in a new executive director who was kind of trying to change things. But you'll see from here kind of the categories that we scored people on. Louisiana, I think they were next to last, and right now, even though we kind of rated their as one of the worst in the nation for patient protection, currently there's a bill being debated in the legislature. It's doing well right now. That would actually further weaken their laws. So some people are calling it the Doctor Protection Act, but that's being debated as we speak. Connecticut did pretty good, not too bad, was a 67. And I was just gonna kind of walk you through and this is gonna look kind of laborious, but and this is all on our website, but I wanna give you guys a chance to see the kind of areas that you could fight for if you wanted change. Transparency. There are a bunch of different ways that you can look for how well do states do on transparency. From do they allow private board orders? Are they even on the website? That kind of thing. Can you find out what's going on, or do they keep it secret? Duty to report. I think for you guys, this is probably a big area. Are there requirements in your state laws that require reporting when you know something is happening? And are there any punishments if you don't do that? I did see a case in Ohio. It was pretty, I think the only one like that we've seen where disciplinary action taken for someone to failure to report. And I think it was a revocation, if I'm not mistaken. That was the only time we've ever really seen things like that. And you know, our courts and prosecutors, we've seen cases, I think this would apply, Larry Nassar case. I call the Michigan Medical Board because I always kind of wondered and never seen much mention of them. They said they never got a report on Dr. Larry Nassar. There were never reports about him over the years. Medical Board never heard about him, did not open a case until the Indianapolis Star exposed him. They opened a case based on that. So no one ever called the board about Dr. Larry Nassar, even though there had been numerous investigations of him. Board composition. Medical licensing boards, we went through every board to see how many public members are there. There's a kind of a standard that at least a fourth of your board should be public members. Most states don't meet that, even though it's been out there for a while. One thing we looked at, no one had ever really even thought about, was, are women well represented on your boards? A lot of boards don't have many women on them. In Connecticut, you guys have 6. Or at the time, it was 6 women on the 21-member board. That was actually pretty decent. So, but I think that makes a difference. But public members are extremely important. We see some states that have close to half. That's big. You know, most states, it's really mostly doctors. Criminal acts are, is there a hammer that comes down if you do something? In California, if you're I think felony level sex offender, you have to lose your license automatically. And that would sound kind of like maybe that would happen anyway. Definitely not the case. So things like that, like, or even are physicians required to undergo background checks? Like I do that before I hire a nanny for my kids. But in Georgia and other states, there's no criminal background check. In a way, it wouldn't matter because in Georgia, oftentimes they'll relicense someone when they get out of prison. So I'm not sure that would be a big factor anyway, even if they knew the information. Discipline laws. Does the state require revocation for certain things? And do medical regulators have the right to access certain information, even peer review, that kind of thing? And then, and this is just showing you kind of how we kind of rated for each category. This is criminal acts. This is the area that was the worst, you know, and this includes things like, is it is it illegal for you to have sex with a patient? We find that there are many more laws related to psychiatrists than there are to non-psychiatrist physicians. And there are obvious reasons for that. There was more of a push for that issue a number of years ago, but there have been some states that have considered just saying, you know, you can't have sexual contact with a patient, and that's not just a board rule, it's a law. And those are very hard to pass. So it's something, but it is, and again, if you're talking about things you want to pursue, does it make sense that that's a law? I think everybody knows it's inappropriate. Should it be illegal? This is one of the victims, and she spoke to like the theme that you guys talked to, Erin Vance. She was in Oregon. She was assaulted by a doctor while she was under anesthesia. Talk about how vulnerable you can be, right? It's just, you're out, you don't know what's happening. Eventually, the doctor was arrested, but it took a long time because it's hard to get the evidence. Sometimes we'll see people walk in when somebody's under anesthesia. I remember several cases like that. Like the nurse walks in, it's like, oh my God, you know. She'll see the act taking place of the assault to somebody, a patient who's out. But even then, I remember a case, I think it was in California, where that happened. The nurse reported it, and it was covered up. And it was only the second time when somebody saw it, that the actual, and then they called the police that time. Here's Maria. She was in our series. She was one of the last, part of the last installment that we did in our series. And her voice was so powerful. It was very hard for us to find victims when we were working on this because of a number of reasons. One, in medical board orders, it's initials. So it'd be like patient MZ. That's all you have to go on. It's very hard to find the people who might want to very well talk with you about how their case was handled and how the medical board reacted. We had to go through a lot of different records, and it was very hard to find people, especially initially. After our report came out, it was easier. We had people coming to us. To this day, well, I'll say, first of all, the very first day this story published in July, I got an email from a lady who lived in Georgia. She was in her 60s, a retired librarian who said she'd been sexually assaulted by a doctor in her 20s. She'd never really gotten over it. 10 years after not going to a doctor at all, she finally realized, oh, I can see women doctors, right? There are women in medicine now. Even like many years later, her doctor tried to bring a male resident in to her appointment. She had to explain why. That was one of the first times she'd ever even talked about it. I think that's changed. We get calls from people now, in part because our series did, and to some degree, what the Boston Globe series did, and said, this isn't just some freak thing that kind of hardly ever happens. This is something that happens way more than anyone has ever acknowledged. It's a thing. I mean, I had people, remember Emory Medical School was like, well, is that really like is that really a thing? And all I could say was, yeah, I mean, after reading all these cases, I can tell you it happens way more than you would imagine. And it's a lot worse than you would imagine in terms of the damage and the cover-up and the enabling that takes place. And I feel like our series did at least put everyone on medical boards across the country and the profession on notice that this is a thing that you need to take seriously. You can read the whole series at our website. It's freeaccessdoctors.ajc.com. There's a ton of videos on there and a billion stories. It's way more than you would want to read. I will say that we did get a lot of recognition from our profession for the work, and that was gratifying. We would like to see, reporters like to get awards, but what we really like to see is that our work changes things, and we hope that takes place, and I think that all of you just being here are part of that change, and I really appreciate your coming here to learn more about it.
Okay, so you have time for questions. Okay, one over here.
Hi, my name is Frank. I'm an internist on the faculty here at Yale. I happen to have a colleague in the state of Georgia, unrelated to any sexual abuse charges, more related to a drug issue, who came before the Georgia board for a renewal and obviously couldn't get a renewal because his infraction was classified as a felony. I think the system for this infraction in Georgia worked very well. You've pointed out that the medical boards cannot handle these people without help. So he spent almost 2 years in the PHP program in Georgia, and they utilized something called the Talbot Center, where he lived for 2 years. He was running out of money. He actually was there and working at Starbucks as a barista during the latter part of last year and this year, and with the recommendation of the PHP to the Georgia Medical Board, that individual, my colleague, did receive his license back. The Georgia Medical Board also has to handle a huge amount of alcoholism, both in physicians and in pilots. And they can be rehabilitated. I don't know what can be done for this addiction, because it is an addiction. Whether any of these centers have the expertise, the knowledge, and the capacity to handle this addiction. My definition as an internist is an addiction is that which you put between yourself and that which you do not want to face. Physicians do it all the time with work. We have a work addiction. And it's not funny because it ruins families. Segue backwards for a moment. That was my comment of the Georgia Medical Board. When I was 13, living in the Bronx, I was fingered, as you would say, by the Irish Catholic clergy, and my parents were told that I had a vocation. A vocation comes from within, not from without. My parents did not know what to do with this kid who has a vocation. They were told what to do. And I would enter the minor seminary in Manhattan, meaning I would go there every day and come home. It was like going to school, only it took a subway and a bus. As this process was unfolding, at age 13, I suddenly found that I was not allowed to take the exam for the Bronx High School of Science. I would not be recommended for that. I said, well, what about Regis High School? My family has no money, and Regis is tuition free in addition to being a scholarship school. No. So I wound up at a school called Cathedral Prep for 3 years. And fortunately, I was a moving target because I went home every day. But many kids from upstate New York stayed there in the guest house sort of arrangement. Those kids were abused. Flash ahead 40 years, and they were the abusers again. It got so bad that my sons would say to me when I read the New York Times in the morning, which of your classmates is in the New York Times today? They have an addiction too, which was covered up and finally exposed. But no one was willing to do anything about it in the system except transfer the problem to other parishes. I was fortunate. I never experienced that kind of come on from anyone. I left at the end of my junior year when I realized they were not saying celebrate, they were saying celibate. And I said, no way, this is not for me. And I left, quickly made up some science grades and went on to college at Fordham, where I was exposed to the Jesuits, which is a whole different group. But it was very, very coercive. You don't take 13-year-olds and do that and then target them, but that's what they did. And if anybody doubts that, talk to people who have left the seminary and find out why. I left because I had a vocation to medicine. I realized that very young. Anyway, I'm talking too long, thank you for your time. But I am familiar with Georgia, and I'm kind of impressed that they can handle these addiction issues rather well. And then when they're, at least the substance abuse issues, using the outside forces, but you're probably better qualified to say whether or not this is an issue anyone in that capacity, not the board, but the health organizations can do. Thank you.
So,
Let me just say one thing about, just on that, what the topic thing you just raised, was that physician burnout is a really big issue in the profession right now. I'm sure you guys have probably heard about this. And that what we see in a lot of these cases is that there are kind of burnout issues that will lead to some of these issues related to substance abuse or sexual misconduct. And that's something I think the profession is pretty serious about right now. But it's a big issue, and it does affect patient safety because these things happen. The other thing about rehabilitation is that one executive director made the point to me is that he feels it's more risky dealing with sexual misconduct because if somebody reoffends, there's immediately a victim. If you start using again, you may not hurt a patient with that. You may or may not. But in misconduct, by definition, if you reoffend, you've hurt a patient.
What was your opinion of the whole, forgetting the sexual abuse issue for a moment, the system in Georgia for handling, say, substance abuse, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's no transparency around it, so it's very hard for us to know how effective it is.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Kayla. I'm a dual degree student at the public health school and the business school. So on the management side of things, care about this a lot. I have a couple questions. One is just, I maybe missed this in your presentation, but I wondered if you had any grand number that you sort of added up, like any sort of data about like the big picture of the scope of the problem. And then also I was wondering if all of the cases were men against women, or if there were different gender dynamics.
I'll take the second one first. It's primarily men against women. We also see man against man, and occasionally women on man or woman on woman. When you see woman on woman, it's usually a psychiatrist and a patient in a relationship. I saw a woman on man. It was mentioned on our series where she was, I think, a surgeon supposed to be doing, I believe it was ENT type work, but she always wanted to check the genitals of the guys who were under anesthesia. She just did that kind of all the time, and it was never noted in the record, and there was no reason for it. I interviewed her, and she, was very confident that she was doing that for medical purpose, but no one really understood what that purpose was. We've seen a fair number of man on man, where it's like sort of the thing in the exam room where somebody will expose themselves and wouldn't be improperly touching another man. And somebody recently had a conversation with a medical board official said, those are the cases we think we probably are very vastly underreported, even more so than perhaps women. I thought that was interesting. I'd never really thought about it before. But primarily, most of them are male physicians and women. A lot of times, a gigantic age difference. You'll see a lot of older physicians in this. You read all these cases and you're amazed. I mean, we've had doctors in their 80s doing this who are, number one, still practicing and maybe burned out, or a lot of older physicians, many over 60. And last thing on the number, we documented, it was about 3,100 cases in our first round where it was verified and the guy had, the doctor had been disciplined. We have since worked on an update and have many more cases, and that'll publish in a few weeks if all goes as planned.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a second-year nursing student here. I know that there's a really good amount of nurse practitioner students here in the audience too, and I was wondering if you knew if the NP boards worked the same way or if they collaborated with medical boards, or like what the laws were surrounding nurse practitioners and how we can push for like better laws for ourselves as well as physicians and physicians assistants, and how we can work together but also advocate for good laws surrounding nurse practitioners.
We've had a lot of people ask us to look at that, and also therapists, non-psychiatrists, but therapists and dentists, because there's an issue in all those areas. I would say a woman doctor who was head of the Georgia Medical Board was a very strong believer in the need for chaperones. In Georgia, and it's actually a requirement, anytime someone of opposite sex is doing an intimate exam, under board rule, they have to have a chaperone in the room. It's a best practice that everyone accepts. She was actually pushing for chaperone even in same-sex intimate exams, feeling that gender's not as cut and dried as it used to be, and that there were just, speaking to the issue of like what combination of gender does these things, she was arguing that should actually be in law, and that was fairly radical, and it didn't pass in Georgia, that for same sex. But I think that is a big issue. Like, it's kind of a big deal. It's not a big deal in the daily practice of medicine to touch somebody's, intimate parts, but it is kind of a big deal, And so how you deal with that and how the processes around that, I think, are really important as we see nurse practitioners do so much work. I would say there might be a need to discuss that. How do we deal with these things? And is it just an opposite gender issue anymore? And that's really a radical thing to discuss. You'll get immediate pushback. Doctors that I talked to about it on the medical board and privately just said, well, if I had to have a chaperone in the room for a same-sex intimate exam, I just wouldn't do the exam. If it were kind of optional, I just wouldn't do it. And so that was really interesting, and that came from some people I really respected, and I was kind of surprised by it. But I think that is a big one to explore. And I would love to it's very hard to do this research. I think another thing we would love to see is some academic research on this topic. We're just newspaper reporters. Most of us have bachelor's degrees. We would love to see somebody, we have big tools in terms of gathering information that would maybe even be hard in some academic settings to pull off because we had people worked on this for so long. Would love to see some research on this topic.
There's favoritism so there, sorry about that. I'm Andy Assis, I'm one of the pediatric faculty here. So you referenced this in your report card, and I really want to respond to your invitation for us to think about how we can lead change. Did you find that representation by non-doctors on medical boards resulted in different outcomes in those states? And is that something, because I'm listening in your words for actionable items beyond the individual level of the doctor's behavior, but really it's resonating with me how much the system has perpetuated these behaviors. So did that help, and if not, what else would you urge us to try to pursue in terms of rule change within our state and beyond?
I think makeup on medical boards is really, really important. In Connecticut, you have actually one of the best consumer members. I don't know if she's still on the board or not. Jean Rexford, she's kind of famous, and I got to know her and working on this series. It's one thing we found was, okay, what kind of consumer member are you going to put on there? Just saying it's a non-doctor, like in Georgia, I think we have somebody who's like a banker and a business person. It's not like they'll tell you, the people, and this is something we scored on, is it somebody who, number one, has no connections to medicine? Like You can't put the doctor's spouse on the medical board as a consumer member. That's not good policy. And some states actually say that. In other states, I mean, you really want somebody who's very comfortable and has sort of a track record on consumer issues and that kind of thing to be on the board. And you can lobby for certain people to be on the boards. Like when there's an opening, you know, you can act and say, like, I think somebody from here should be on this board who would really be a consumer member, somebody from your law school. I think one state might require a malpractice attorney actually serve on the board, and you know, a plaintiff's attorney to try to really bring that perspective in there.
Well, they're victim advocates.
Yes. And we don't see that. A lot of times it's people with political connections. Generally it's your governor appointing. Sometimes it's people who make a lot of campaign contributions. I think it does make a difference, but it's really hard to test that scientifically. I will tell you, when California made a big change when they said somebody who's a felony level registered sex offender is automatic revocation, that came off of a guy who was a parole officer being on the board. And he saw what was happening, this guy, he's in our series, and said he eventually got into the legislature and passed that law because he knew the board wouldn't do it. They wouldn't go. The board fought the law as well. But I think that's a very good place to start. Transparency is really important. Also, we found that when cops got involved, you know, it took a while, but in Maria's case, there was eventually something that happened. Cops are sometimes a little less likely to, they will investigate sometimes, more so than the boards. Boards have investigators, but they often only have a few investigators. And they're dealing with people, like right now where we're doing tons of opioid overprescribing, and that's a big priority. And so I would say automatic required reporting to police is helpful. If you go on our website and look at what Delaware passed, you can kind of see what they were trying to do so that Earl Bradley couldn't happen again. And a lot of it was duty to report, because a ton of people knew about them. But I would say saying certain things are not legal and duty to report to the laws that require reporting to the cops can be helpful. Again, Larry Nassar was reported to the cops like more than 10 years ago. They recently apologized because they didn't believe the victim. So.
Hi, my name's Maggie. I'm also a nursing student. Actually, I think more than half of us are nursing students.
Yay, nurses!
First, I wanted to thank Maria for sharing her testimony and also for taking up this cause to protect other female body patients and other patients from being assaulted. That's great. Thank you for that. And also for you for doing this great work. I have a whole list of questions because that's the way I work. So first, I want to start, and this probably is just me being in my first year, but maybe it's not. Who are you reporting these things to? And does that work differently in different places? I know many people who would actually already in our first year like to report some of these things. So where are we supposed to go to report those things? And then is that different again on the nurse issue? Are nurses reporting these types of activities to different people than doctors are reporting them to? And then, so we talked a little bit about reporting them to the police versus reporting them to the medical board. Like should you be reporting it all the way down? Like what's your advice there?
Yeah, I would say victims find themselves confused, like when it happens, it's like, what should I do? And there's no set answer to that. I think you should probably report to your institution. It's risky, right? Because how's your institution going to react to that?
Like the ethics department of the institution? Like who are you reporting it to specifically? We've literally been trying to report it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say it would be, that's a good question, and I can't answer that within an academic setting where you should go to, but if it's within...
Like, if it's happening here, Merle Waxman was just here. She's the ombudsperson, right? So Yale University has different Title IX reporters. They have Merle Waxman. She is one of the Title IX reporters. That would be an obvious place for you to start. You can always go to your deans and stuff. But definitely, like the first thing that just comes to my mind is Merle Waxman, because that is her role. Like that's who you should go to.
And a lot of hospitals will have a patient advocate or a process of reporting any in any to a department, and I would say it could be HR, but I think there's usually a patient safety type office that I would say could be the right person. In terms of boards and the police, a lot of patients will report to boards and the police. Some people don't know about medical boards, a lot of people don't. But I would say if it's a crime, you should go to the police. But there's some things that are not a crime, but like you'll see a lot of cases. It wouldn't be a crime that this took place. An orthopedist who's seeing the high school soccer player and then starts texting her nonstop about her boobs and how he wants to show her his thing and this and like nonstop. Well, I've seen a lot of those in student health offices too. Like somebody comes in for counseling at student health and then the student health doctor is like, hey, like hundreds of texts. And so things like that, probably there's not illegal, but it's something the board should be aware of because that's clearly improper.
Yeah, thank you. And before I move on to the next next question, just to bring it back to actionable items, knowing who to report to as nursing students and all students is like definitely an actionable item. We should be taught that in the beginning for anybody who's on faculty in here. And then I had another point about that, but I lost it. Anyway, so now my next question, sorry, is what if you were to be, this probably is also a silly question, but if you lose your license in the state of Georgia, can you then just go to Virginia and apply for a license there?
You're not supposed to be, but we do see it happens. Like if most states will take a reciprocal action, so they're supposed to be informed when an action takes place, or if you apply for licensure in a new state, you're usually asked, have you had any disciplinary action in a previous state? We've seen it happen, but we've also seen a lot of reciprocal actions where somebody gets revoked in one state. We've seen it both ways, where the hammer will come down, but we've seen it where it maybe won't. There's something called the National Practitioner Data Bank. I didn't even go into that. It's a federal confidential data bank of actions against the license for physicians. But there are a lot of negotiating that goes around when something might happen in the hospital. Somebody will leave and then avoid getting reported there. There's a lot of ways that the information isn't necessarily known. But when one board takes an action, the other boards generally do find out.
Interesting about the provider data bank, that's actually half public, half private, because it's all funded through, it's not funded at all through the federal government, it's funded through people paying to purchase those records, so there's probably a lot of like pushback that you could do there. Last question, and then I'll stop hogging the mic. And that's, what are the major, so we talked a lot about like the policy behind these things and like laws that are being pushed for and not successfully going through or successfully going through. What are the major lobbying actors here and how can we become a part of that sort of justice process, legal process?
The strongest, in almost every state, one of the strongest lobbying organizations is usually the State Medical Association. And so they're generally opposed to further regulation, and that's very hard to work against. In terms of pushing for change, is that what you're really asking about? There is really no group that has taken this up beyond. Public Citizen has done some really good work in this area. Consumers Union, they're all kind of one organization. In California, they were very, very active in the last couple of years, wanting to see if your doctor was actually on probation with restrictions that your patient should be informed of that. Your doctor is under some kind of chaperone requirement or other things like you should know. There was big battles fought over that. And I would say they've probably been the most active group. And generally what you'll see is when things get passed, it's one person who makes it their mission because they're really, like, when the priest thing happened, this hasn't really been known very long as a big issue. Really, since our exposing it is only when it was recognized as a bigger thing that might need to be addressed So there's not really an infrastructure to deal with it. There aren't that many patient safety organizations around that have a ton of resources. But you'll find in some states, there are consumer organizations that will take it on. But most of the time, I've seen there'll be like one person who has a horrible experience who says, I'm gonna make it my mission to change law.
In Georgia, let's say someone decides as a physician, they want to start their life in another state, and they're going to apply, say, for a Connecticut license, for example. In that instance, the PHP, which has been involved in the treatment of that physician, say it was for alcohol, and has signed off on him or her as being fit for practice, and they get a Georgia license, they apply in the state of Connecticut. There are things going on way outside the board. The PHPs are in touch with one another. Here in Connecticut, it's called Haven. And before the board is even involved in signing off on something, that you have to be passed through that system, which is fairly rigorous. I'm not talking about sexual abuse, because I don't think it's being handled very well at all. But other addictions are. And I think you gave a great talk, and I think it's important for the audience, particularly younger people, to realize that these doctors are sick. They're sick people. They have an addiction that is harmful to society, and it may not even be curable. Other things, I think, are far more curable than this. I don't think we have the skills yet to effectively deal with this kind of issue because it's been under the carpet for so long. I don't know of any priest who's been effectively rehabilitated. I know a lot who were transferred for this issue. And I don't really know what is being done for physicians who need care themselves. They may not ever be able to practice again, but they're still sick.
Robert, can I just add one more thing? So other than the Title IX coordinators and the ombudsperson, you guys at Yale, anyone at Yale also has access to the Share Center, right? It's the only I'm like struggling on the words, but like anyone can call them. It's confidential. You can also go to the university-wide committee, UWC, on sexual misconduct, right? They're the ones that would do both informal and formal types of things. And they're all separate but connected in the sense that like if you go to any one of, if you approach the ombudsperson, they would know about the UWC and the Share. If you go to Share, they would know about this stuff. They're like, even in the hospital, there is a person, I forget his title, but like they have power to like shut down a surgeon's cases, like the OR. They have the power to like shut down the OR until things have been addressed. This happened with a faculty member not too long ago who had reports and cases, and this person just shut down his OR until things. So like to kind of address this thing that like, sometimes we feel like when we do these things, it's just kind of up in the air, no one's listening, or they don't actually have any actionable power. But at least over the last few years, there's been more and more that's been going towards trying to address some of these issues. So I would definitely say the Share Center, the UWC, ombudsperson, there's Title IX coordinators in every school would be the places where you should start. You of course have your deans. Yeah, just to make sure that everyone here at least knows of the resources here at Yale.
Let us know how it works out.
I have more questions.
I'm Kayla. I'm a medical student planning on going into psychiatry. I was just wondering if you could comment more about these issues specifically as it relates to psychiatry, because patients with mental health issues, as you've alluded to, are more vulnerable to these types of abuse, but also more likely to be accused of false reporting due to delusional disorders, personality disorders, and the like. So I'm just wondering how the cases you know about have played out, and if psychiatrists maybe in some ways are more likely to be to be to face justice just because there's no real physical exam contact, but also since there is no physical exam, there aren't any chaperones. So I guess I'm wondering sort of how a psychiatrist would protect himself or herself, and also just how these cases play out.
In the cases that we saw, the only time a psychiatrist is publicly disciplined by a board, it's generally, the facts are pretty intense. Some of those, I've seen a couple cases where it's verbal, like, you're gonna want me when you get a little older, and you're gonna wanna be with me, and this is in the middle. That's just like, it's 20 sessions of that, that is clearly inappropriate to talk about anything like that during the exam, or during a session. But generally what we saw, where I can think of one we wrote about, where at the end of the session, the doctor literally grabbed the patient's breast and exposed himself. It's pretty graphic stuff. We do see doctors who will encourage a patient to have a sexual relationship with them, who are psychiatrists, arguing it will help them recover. And so those things are never okay, and there's generally some evidence of that. There'll be either text messages, or sometimes when the police get involved, they'll have the patient wear a wire or somehow record a call where it's discussed. I didn't see much where there was not very, very clear evidence of that. I think the thing that was most disturbing in those cases, it's often somebody who had a history of being abused. And so, I remember one where the comment was when they were having sex, "Oh, is this how it was when you were with your father?" The doctor made that comment. So I understand what you're saying. I was at a American Psychiatric Association meeting in Atlanta, where the top guy on boundaries was addressing some of these things. And a lot of the young women in training were dealing with the fact that a lot of their patients were coming on to them, trying to date them, and how do you deal with that? It's very difficult. But I would say it's a difficult field because transference is so powerful, and it's hard to deal with. And if someone wants to take advantage of that, it's just very easy to do. But I would say I didn't feel like I saw a lot of cases where it was just a he said, she said. There was clearly some very strong evidence that somebody's license was being disciplined. I think one thing I learned from that too is a lot of people going into therapy don't understand what the boundaries are supposed to be. They don't like that whole session. There was a whole discussion of when is it okay to hug your patient? If someone's just died and they're crying, is that ever okay? That made me understand how strict the lines are. And I think it might help sometimes if people coming into therapy understood that. Like these are the ground rules of what's never supposed to happen between us. I'm not going to talk about my wife because that's inappropriate, or those kinds of things. But it is a very risky area for the reasons you said.
It's me again. I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that we have an amazing activist survivor with us and steer a little bit towards that. Do you have any sort of because you have a room of captive future and current providers, any sort of advice about how we as providers can interact with patients who are survivors of sexual assault at the hands of doctors, particularly in those first few interactions? Like you said, you went a long time being afraid to go to the doctor. Are there things that you now, on the other side of this experience, that you find to be positive and negative as a patient of doctors and nurses and things like that?
I would say I'm comfortable again with a male doctor. I just feel like if everybody is themselves, and I'm usually a good like I can tell like if the vibe is off, or if now I'm really like I look at everybody, like this, and I've overcome it. I would just say, just be yourselves. That's all you can do is be yourself. If you're a good person, it's just gonna happen. I never took like any sort of touching, or you know what I'm saying. It was never awkward before. It was kind of like, hey, how are you? Let me do your, So just be yourselves, do your job. Just be careful, because nowadays I feel like everybody is saying, oh, I got touched this way, or I got touched that way, or somebody said something to me, and it's like they don't really know. Like, I mean, I've been in a workplace where I was sexually harassed by a manager. And so you're going to be put in a position maybe one day where it could happen to you. Just be aware of what you're doing. And I also feel like if you don't have the intentions of doing anything to anybody, or there's always the way I see it is there's always somebody looking for a problem. Patient-wise, at least, you understand what I'm saying, right? So you have to be cautious, but you also have to be yourself. That's the only thing, you have to be true to yourself. You know who you are, right? So just know you're there to do your job. You're not there to harm anybody. But like, if you see something, like I said, like, secretaries knew what were going on. Now, they were nurses. They weren't I keep saying secretaries because they did both. They sat behind the desk. And if you know what's going on, and you're okay with watching what's going on, and you should have a problem with yourself. You know what I'm saying? So if you're not that kind of person, you make sure from the minute you see it, report it, because you're changing. The doctor, I don't know if he realized how much it was going to affect my life. I have kids, so it's like you put yourself in a position where it's, are you going to stand by and let this happen? And so, like I said, just be true to yourself. Just be honest. And if you see something, say something. I sound like a campaign ad.
I'm curious whether having a third party in the room would be comforting to you, or...
No, I'm fine. My daughter is usually with me. She's 10. She's usually with me. So
I mean, like another healthcare provider. Would that make you feel more comfortable, or not necessarily?
No. I know the touch. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know. So I'm very aware when I'm being touched. The doctor I have now does really not like to make contact. I fell on my tailbone, and he didn't even want to go there. He was like, go get an X-ray. He didn't want to go there. So he's smart. So I trust him. But when I think about it, when I started with the doctor, she used to come in with me. So it started out like she was there, and all of a sudden, I guess I just didn't notice because I was, but then all of a sudden she was not coming in anymore. And I definitely feel like she was in on it. So if you're going to go into that field and be a nurse, do it for the right reasons. I don't know what was going on between them, but she obviously didn't value her position. Thank you, who said that? Somebody, her position. And my thing is like, after I got after him, she kept her job. But little did she know, see, when you do good things for people and you stay true to yourself, there's always somebody in the mix thrown in to help you. And I knew somebody who, when they took over the doctor's office, took care of her kid for a very long time. She said to me, is Maria still there? And I said, yes, she is. And I said, I don't know how she still has her job. She was part of it. She was harassing me, she was part of it. And it just took that one person to go tell her superior what Maria had done, and she lost her job. And I feel no guilt about that because you were part of it. And as a nurse, as a nurse, you're supposed to be protecting us. She knew what I went through. She's seen 9 years of different phases of me. So, you were okay with that? You shouldn't be a nurse. My theory is like, I don't understand people who go into nursing or or even being a doctor. Like, did they go into it for this reason? Like him, did he go into it for this reason? We don't know, but like I said, just stay true to yourselves and just like maybe put yourself in the patient's position if you can, But everybody's so sensitive today, you have to be careful. Like, it's like,
I think it's just odd in coming from a non-healthcare field.
Microphone.
It's just coming from a non-healthcare field. I've worked HR, I've held sexual harassment hearings. If you know something's different about something, if you know somebody acts different, if you just suspect anything, I think it's important for you not only to take your own notes, but to be in tune to everybody around you.
yes.
Because you never know. And I know in corporate for years we've had an obligation to report something. And I think it's a little odd that in the healthcare field, we don't have that, and maybe that could be something in the future. A standard procedure maybe, or like you said, during training, because people want to know. It's not you as a healthcare provider just turning an ear. You want to know to help or to maybe report if you see something. Nobody wants to be the person to report. I mean, nobody wants to ruin their career or anyone else's, but in some cases or in many cases, you have to, and that's what they're finding. And just because I'm not a healthcare provider, but as a patient, being a patient after especially having a child, females are very vulnerable. We don't learn everything until we get there.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of us want to read the book about having a baby and what we're going to happen or find, and we're in a room suddenly and we let anybody do anything. Take blood, sure, and so it's a vulnerable position, and sometimes we blame ourselves and not say anything because it's just what we have to do. So, not to get sympathy, but just go through the motions, and we're all busy. Like he said, men, women, our families suffer, we're busy, we just put things aside.
Oh,
so.
my family suffered after. I mean, I wasn't right.
And as a friend of
You know,
hers,
she knows.
you catch up and.
What they need to do is they need to, I try to get therapy after, because you get to a point in your life, you've been through so much crap, and you're like, you know what, this is it, I maybe need to get some therapy. And I had a victim's advocate, and it had been a rough 2 years for me, I had been through a lot. And I tried to get therapy, and I run my own business, and I work for myself, and because I couldn't produce pay stubs, they were turning me down left and right. Now I had people that I run a cleaning business. I was a kindergarten teacher for 16 years, started my own business. They were not validating me because I couldn't give them pay stubs. And I had everybody I worked for, amounts, everything there was nothing hidden, and they still didn't want to help me. Like, how is that possible when they give the doctor therapy? He was resistant to it. The judge said, you are resistant to it. He went once and said, I want my license back. He was resistant to therapy. How is it that I'm asking for help so I can get myself better for my kids in normal life, and they turn me down? That's like my next step is like, something has to change. Where are our rights? Nobody even called me to apologize to the police department.
We have
Like,
HIPAA forms.
nobody
we're
cares.
familiar with that, but
Nobody cares about the victim.
yeah.
Nobody cares.
Sorry, we're wrapping up.
You're wrapping up? Yeah.
Sorry, I talked too much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Yeah, maybe this isn't working. Maybe we can all take like a collective breath in and out. Thank you all for being here, especially you two. This is just so important to sit through, and I know you heard firsthand the barriers you see with the Me Too movement, let alone just to survivors in general, the barriers to speaking up about it, but then especially when you're in a setting in which the power dynamic is so stark and right there, right there in your face. So as we're all going to be providers, it's just really great to be reminded of that. So thank you. And so what can we all do? We're talking about action. So as we said, we had some really great conversations tonight about pushing for policy changes, calling your state legislator, talking, advocating, lobbying for people to be on the state medical board, super important. And yeah, I want to finish up by saying that it's when one person speaks up, you just make it really easy for everybody else to.
Yeah.
So thank you, and thank you, Carrie, and please send that message back. Yeah, thank you all.